Leaf is perhaps one of the most defining studios within the entire visual novel industry. Though they may now be a dust-collecting 18+ sub-brand of Studio Aqua Plus, they were once a juggernaut, a studio which rose from nothing to everything with the release of 1997's Two Heart, the game which arguably solidified romancing cute girls with only dialogue choices into one of the most important Japanese adventure game subgenres to ever exist, blessing us all with wonderful moe girls and tear-jerking stories for years to come. Before they broke into the mainstream, however, Leaf spent 2 years experimenting and trying to find their way, first unsuccessfully with RPG and Mahjong games in 1995, and to marginal success in January of 1996 with Shizuku. While far from the first game to resemble modern choice-based VNs as a whole, as developers had already simplified adventure games at that point before it, it was the first to take the specific sound novel format that had been beloved on the Super Famicom since the early 1990s and place it on home computers with anime images and adult media in tow, christened by Leaf as Visual Novel Volume 1. Regardless of the life that term took on its own in English faces many years later, my own thoughts on Shizuku is frankly a mess of a game, and how major its individual role really was in the broader Japanese adventure game genre, as well as tons of other things I go into my video about it, it undeniably plays a large part in Leaf's own history as the game that laid the groundwork for their nearly 2-decade-long run of innovative and thought-provoking titles. However, before Shizuku was even finished, Leaf already began production on a second game in the visual novel series, one which would focus on an interesting story more than anything else, and prove to even the most weary of critics that Leaf had the potential to become something great. And it just so happens to be what I would truly, sincerely consider the first modern visual novel. Released in October of 1996, Kizuato is one of the titles that exemplifies the weird and ethereal in-between period adult Japanese adventure games were going through in the mid to late 90s. Not only was the genre shifting away from porn with story to story with porn, throwing the industry into a bit of an identity crisis, but developers were experimenting more than ever with varying styles of play, both simpler and complex, as technology accommodated faster gameplay, cleaner text, and more detailed imagery. To add the cherry on top of the bizarre sundae, Kizuato came smack dab in the middle of the shift from NEC's proprietary PC-98 DOS platform with its own custom graphics and sound systems to the far more generic and universal Windows platform, promising affordability to the end user, better compatibility across a wider range of diversified computers, and greater visual and oral capabilities for devs to utilize. However, unlike titles such as Kichikuo Rance or even Leaf's own Two Heart, which took full advantage of what Windows had to offer and beckoned people to switch, Kizuato is one of the last of the old guard, being made primarily for NEC's dying platform and ported to Windows near identically. Where Kizuato differentiates itself from all that came before is in how it, along with Yuno a few months later, solidified what we would come to expect from multi-root VNs. It told the tale of Koichi Kashiwagi, a young man who visits his 4 cousins after the mysterious sudden death of his father and begins seeing visions of violent murders in his dreams, unable to figure out if the culprit, rumored to be a demon, is another him or somebody else entirely. It's not long after that he's led to unravel a mystery spanning space and time, finding out the truth behind his cursed family lineage, the secrets his cousins have been hiding, and what it means to untether oneself from their own bloody past. Unlike prior sound novels and many of their mimics, which tended to tell single core narratives with bits swapped in and out based on choices, Kizuato is the kind of proper multi-root mystery of deep lore, plot-relevant bad ends, and compounding themes that we tend to associate with the genre now. The kind of game akin to a work by Nitro Plus, Type Moon, or 7th Expansion, years before any of them would make their gaming debut. I make those particular comparisons because key developers behind all 3 have explicitly named Kizuato as an influence on them, the sole exception being Nasu of Type Moon, who instead took such great inspiration from the title for Tsukihime that some have called it a ripoff over the years. I think those calls are greatly exaggerated, but there's definitely a number of parallels that can be drawn between them, as I'll poke at in this video. Even putting that particularly extreme example aside, however, you can really see the connection between this and what would come after. The structure of the story, the toony superhuman powers, the grand scale of the narrative, the types of characters it features, the tropes it relies on, the twists and turns it takes, all of it feels like the blueprint which so many creators worked from to craft their own worlds and layered narratives. And yet, for better and for worse, Kizuato is its own work. Its own very schlocky, very tropey, B-movie-esque work that can be a blast to read but sort of falls apart the more you think about it. The terrible way it handles sex, the simplicity of the characters, the underdeveloped twists and themes, and the utterly bizarre ending, it all comes together to remind readers that though Takahashi might have grown in the 9 months between this and Shizuku, he was still far from being at the height of his career. Despite my gripes, it's not a game that I at all regret reading, nor is it one that feels too painfully vintage, unlike Shizuku, regardless of whether you're playing the 1996 original or the 2009 remake like I did for this video. We don't talk about the 2002 game. We will, but we don't. I did play a chunk of the 1996 game, and I will talk about it as the video goes on, but here's my quick summary of why I didn't go all the way with it. The remake is the same game, but with a slightly more refined script, welcome additional scenes, better music rendition, quality of life that isn't total ass, and overall more consistent art quality. For what my money is worth, I personally believe it's better while still being faithful to what was so impactful to authors and gamers at the time. Or, well, I guess my money doesn't really matter here because Aqua Plus delisted this and most other games under the Leaf brand from digital storefronts. Isn't it great when developers decide to arbitrarily remove historically important titles from public access? Don't you love living in the future? Regardless of my sarcastic disdain for our current consumerist dystopia, Kizuato still exists, it shall continue to exist, and I shall sing my praises and my criticisms of it, because I ultimately enjoyed the game a lot as a pulpy thriller, even with its various flaws leading the experience to sour in the days that followed watching its odd final hours. So, without further ado, let's dive into one of the games that brought the genre forward and see what it has to offer now. The ties to one's family and past can be a complicated subject. Though some hold close bonds with all that share their blood and cherish them as loved ones, others keep their distance. One such person is Koichi Kashiwagi, a young man who lived a peaceful life until one day his uncle passed away in an unsolved murder case, and in turn, his father Kenji disappeared to take his place in the family company, off to a faraway rural city, now living with Koichi's cousins. 8 years have passed since that fateful day with barely a word from or about his estranged father, until suddenly a call came in from the eldest of his cousins. Just like his uncle before, Koichi's father has died in a mysterious accident, leading the college boy to cancel his plans for summer vacation in order to stay with the 4 grieving sisters: the motherly and caring Chizuru, the tomboyish and bright Azusa, the quiet and fearful Kaede, and the young and chipper Hatsune. Though things seem well at first, it soon becomes clear that something isn't right with the family. Everyone acts as if something horrible has happened in Koichi's past and keeps their distance from him, perhaps related to a childhood scar on his body that seems to carry more significance than a mere play accident. Even worse, Koichi begins to see horrifying dreams that no one can or wants to explain, a voice beckoning him to release his inner self and give in to his most base desires like an animal. All of this reaches a head when one day, as a friend of Azusa's is over, the voice suddenly calls to him. She is his prey. Horrified, he runs down in a cold sweat and faints in the woods, watching in his sleep a vision of a grotesque creature brutally murdering strangers and cornering the girl he just met. When he comes back and the morning news confirms the worst the next day, that this violent case really did happen, Koichi is thrown into a spiral of confusion and horror. Faced with the reality that something terrible may be lurking inside him, something possibly related to the town legends of the brutal Oni of Uzukiyama, he's left with no choice but to push forward and solve the mysteries that surround him. Is he truly possessed by another force, or is he somehow linked to some monstrous creature? Do the legends have something to do with the mysterious passing of his family? And just what is truly running through the Kashiwagi blood, and is Koichi fated to become a killer? Only time will tell, and time may be the only thing the family is without. If there is any way I could summarize Kizuato's story vibes in a few words, it would be that it's simple but entertaining. Even if you are comparing it against future works that inspired it, which are far greater in length and depth, Kizuato's story is the adventure game equivalent of a pulp horror drama, or I guess more aptly a late 80s action horror OVA. Beyond the simplistic archetypal characters with just enough to latch onto, you can expect to see a lot of scenes of slasher-like violence, cruel sexual deeds that straddle the line between cheap shock horror and dark erotica, and twists and turns of family history that feel like they were ripped out of an off-hours J-horror broadcast your mom warned you not to watch. However, there's a style and seriousness to it all that takes the game out of the realm of parody, like say 1992's Dead of the Brain is in, and into something that's more reminiscent of future works. The conflicts between parts of oneself, the hidden horrifying family histories, the fight scenes that go all in on over-the-top powers and high stakes, and even the main hooks of what the demons are and their relation to the Kashiwagi bloodline feels like what would turn into the last 25 years of dark plot-focused eroge. The world it sets up for all of this is very much a standard 1990s Japan, with the biggest change from reality being, well, the presence of demons, or Oni to be more exact, Japanese creatures of myth that are often said to blend in with humans and possess incredible strength which they use to brutalize them. You learn early on, within the first root of 4, that in Kizuato's world they really do exist, and the blood of a clan flows through that of the Kashiwagi family. How exactly that happened though, and why the powers seem to be giving Koichi telepathic incel rage dreams, isn't fully explained until the very end, same with the broader history of the Kashiwagi family and the Oni. That, along with all the smaller connected mysteries which play out in each chapter, such as the identity of the killer and the origin of the scar on Koichi's body, are the lifeblood of Kizuato's plot, as the characters don't really have much to them. Goichi Kashiwagi serves as our main character here, and as that, he's a run-of-the-mill heroic do-gooder. He's kind and caring, a little bit snarky sometimes, likable and charming, responsible but not too orderly, and a voice of cool reason at times of heightened emotions. If you have read basically any VN in the last 25 years, then you know exactly what this man is like. While he doesn't grow much throughout the story per se, in fact there's very little development for anybody, he still manages to have some strong emotional moments and interesting bits that come out of his family background and anxieties over his lurking powers, and his basic personality is compelling enough to make him a fun character to follow throughout the 4 routes. He is also perhaps the most infamous example of Kinoko Nasu being inspired by this game, as massive parts of his backstory and subsequently foundations for Tsukihime's plot are shared with Shikitono. Both of them are descendants of families with demonic histories, were involved in tragic accidents before the start of the games which left them with plot important scars, have demonic powers which threaten to overtake their normal selves and kill people, and even similar personalities. There is a handful of other odd similarities too, like how the games are segmented. Similar to how Tsukihime has near and far side arcs, with the former focusing on vampire lore and the latter more on family lore, Kizuato also has a first half focusing on current family lore, and a second half focusing on the Oni lore and deeper secrets. Once again, I think it is hyperbolic and ridiculous to call Tsukihime a ripoff of Kizuato, but the parallels are worth noting. Unlike any of Nasu's works, however, you really shouldn't go into this expecting the characters to be deep, as everyone here is pretty much a common anime character archetype, sometimes with conflicts and sometimes without. Chizuru, Goichi, maybe Kaede, and the villain of the first arc are the only characters who I'd say actually have depth to them, and even that stretching it. This extends to many of the side characters as well, though them being a bit simple is to be expected. You have the kind old man detective Nagase, Koichi's cute bookworm classmate Yumiko, a journalist named Kyoko who investigates the bizarre murder case, and a handful of others who do a solid job at adding intrigue and depth to the story, even with their simplicity. It does bear mentioning that all these character issues were significantly worse in the 1996 version of the game. Both of the major releases after it, Renewal in 2002 and Remake in 2009, added additional scenes to expand on Kaede and Chizuru, resulting in them at least becoming more than the 2 traits I described for each of their earlier synopses. Even at their best, they're all too simple to really have much to say about in the context of the game, but it is interesting to see how just gestures at personalities and personal conflicts was enough to win people over back when combined with quality writing, which the game certainly has. The simple personalities shine through in such vibrant and fun ways that you can't help but enjoy the moment to moment, keeping the experience entertaining while it's going on, even if there isn't much to reflect to by the end. The prose as well plays an important part in making this story as fun as it is. Each line is easy to digest and well placed, with detail present when needed and excluded when it's not, and though the language is often simple, it's just as often evocative and captivating, giving the game a strong atmosphere throughout. It can be thrilling, unnerving, tear-jerking, comfortable, and any other number of moods, flowing smoothly between them all. What is a little less smooth, however, is that story structure, as Kizuato's main plot kinda ends once you've hit the halfway point. The hook the game opens with, whether or not Goichi is a killer and by what means, is completely answered after finishing Chizuru and Azusa's route, leaving the second half to focus on introducing new backstory and resolving the handful of remaining questions. I have seen some players criticize the back half as significantly less enjoyable because of this, though I personally enjoyed the shift in focus. It helps as well that the game is built entirely around this structure. Each of the 4 routes takes place in a separate timeline, and progression through them is locked to a certain order of Chizuru, Azusa, Kaede, and Hatsune. Only the most necessary information is repeated between each of them, and even then, what's repeated is often fleshed out by way of getting a new perspective on that info. Through this, the game is pretty effectively able to build a multi-route mystery that legitimately feels like a modern VN. You start off knowing nothing, and the first route having a general idea of many blank spots, and continue having those blank spots slowly filled as the general idea gets reiterated and re-expanded, until you finally reach the conclusion to it all. If this sounds like your cup of tea, like it is for me when I don't want to think, then chances are you're going to enjoy the 15 or so hours it takes to read through the game at a fluent pace. But if you want something with strong themes and characters alongside a compelling breakneck progression, then you're probably going to be left wanting. Basically what I'm getting at is that you should set your expectations for something like Ixer 1 or Cybernetics Guardian, and not Serial Experiments Lane or Killing Fantasy. While I'm fine with everything I've just outlined, where I think the game undeniably falls apart in its writing is with the romance and the sex. The former is just bland, honestly. Without exception, every single one of the heroines is a I loved you since long ago type, which the plot uses as an excuse to spend no time developing any sort of romance. In the case of Azusa and Hatsune's ending, it literally just gets tacked onto the last few minutes so they can have some 18+ scenes. This is also where I should note the whole cousins thing, because yep, all 4 of the heroines are related to Koichi, and I'm 99% sure it's just so Takahashi had a convenient way to set the childhood close friend romances up without actually developing the characters. The game never really comments on or does anything with the familial romance thing, which incidentally does lead to a very amusing bit where the game is totally chill with people doing it with their cousins, but is weary about the homosexuals. Azusa's classmate in the intro of the game, who otherwise otherwise only exists to get tortured by the villain, is basically just a walking man-hating lesbian stereotype that gives Azusa anxiety over being assaulted. The 2009 game takes a kind of funny turn with Azusa being portrayed as comically homophobic, but the 1996 game goes along with it like we have an epidemic of lesbians going after straight girls. I get it, it's the 1990s, but this was shit back then and it's shit now. The same goes with how the game handles assault on the whole, even putting aside it being turned into a punchline at points, which is a giant fucking elephant-sized aside. It is always treated here as an event that sucks when it happens, but has an impact which is either minor or can be healed through the kind words of a nice man. It is bad, but it's at least bad in a stereotypical 90s way, unlike Shizuku's abysmal true ending. That doesn't make it acceptable, but I at least wasn't yelling about it on Discord 5 minutes later. At least the actual sex scenes themselves, in a vacuum devoid of context of what happens after, aren't offensively bad, I suppose, though I'd hardly consider them great either. While the CGs are generally gorgeous, the actual erotica part of the scenes never once hit for me due to the writing feeling too static and stale. This goes for both the consensual and non-consensual scenes. It's just so bland and unremarkable in an otherwise brisk and enthralling plot. Honestly, if these scenes and their consequences actually carried any weight in the story beyond shock and were more frequent than they were, then I'd call them game-breaking. But as it stands, they're just annoying roadblocks that are bound to turn understandably icked players off. It is baffling to me that apparently Leaf thought these were super necessary, as the planned all-ages PSP version in 2007 got canned because they weren't happy with the cuts they needed to make. However, in a legitimately interesting and clever business move, they decided to make the best of the material that had already been completed, voice acting, artwork, script edits, new content, and so forth, in order to further refine the groundwork they laid with the 2002 renewal release. And that is a perfect segue to begin discussing this game's weird release history. Kizuato was first released in 1996 for the PC-98, with a direct port for Windows 95 coming out the same day. Both versions are basically identical except for their soundtracks. While the PC-98 game offered chiptune for the basic 98 soundboard and MIDI support, the Windows version took the chiptune out in favor of a genuinely fantastic CD audio soundtrack. 6 years later, in 2002, the game was released for Windows 98 and onwards as Kizuato Renewal, sporting an interesting new art style and a soundtrack that more or less seems to be a recording of the MIDI score through a higher-end sound module. It looks and feels cheap, with its only positive changes being the massively improved QOL and in the writing. This is the release where the grand majority of edits were made to the script, with 2009 only making minor changes thereon, and these were all done by Takahashi to my knowledge, so this and the 09 game are the definitive versions of the story. As for what those edits are, like I said before, it's mostly a handful of added scenes, as well as some sporadic edits for consistency, clarity, and brevity. Having read about a third of the 1996 game, I believe these are all for the better, as it does make the game feel marginally more professional and consistent, even if they don't fix the core issues of the writing. Perhaps the most drastic change, however, is the complete removal of a bonus scenario. The original 1996 Windows release included a bonus story written by a friend of Takahashi's, which was, depending on your perspective, either made in tribute to or plagiarism of Keisuke Yoshizawa's sci-fi story Dekizuki. Users of 2channel, basically Japan's 4chan, first noticed the similarities around 1999, leading to years of debates that annoyed everyone from users to moderators, spawned a separate website for Key and Leaf discussions at a dedicated Autogame board on 2channel, Leaf to eventually release a public statement in 2001, and to finally remove the scenario from all future releases. It's really a massive clusterfuck of events that had a shockingly high impact, and I would highly recommend watching Bowl of Lento's video on the history of Leaf, where he goes into more detail about it and Leaf in general. That video is also where I found multiple Japanese language sources I've been using throughout this review, so a huge thank goes to him as well for putting together such a rich, expansive, and well-researched video that is serving Leaf fans to this day. The final release of the game then would be the 2009 remake. It is heavily based on the 2002 release, featuring almost the exact same script for the main game, and even reuses some assets such as backgrounds. A lot has been changed, however, on the aesthetic level, including a radically different art style for sprites and CGs far more in line of contemporary Leaf works like Usagi and Two Heart 2, yet another soundtrack rendition, and there's even a sequel scenario starring Kizuato's very own Poochie the dog, Rika. It's not good, but we'll get to that. Which version you should play really comes down to why you're playing Kizuato in the first place. If you're only or mostly interested in the history, then the 96 release is clearly the way to go. Just keep in mind that its vintage means a ton of quality of life features we expect now are missing. You only get free save slots called bookmarks here, no text skip functionality, a clunky backlog, and a font that can be frustrating to read at times due to it blending in with the backgrounds. And some of this is alleviated in the 2009 Origins release, which is based on the 1996 Windows game, but it's still not great. If you want a more polished and consistent experience with the bells and whistles that make reading visual novels far more comfortable, then I would suggest going for the 2009 release, as the QOL enhancements from the XLVNS engine, as well as the changes to the main scenario, make for a much better time overall. Ultimately though, I guess the deciding factor for most folks, given that there really aren't giant changes between the stories of the two, will be the art style they prefer. Kizuato's art was originally illustrated by Toru Minazuki, a friend of Takahashi who worked closely with him throughout his entire career, and much like Shizuku before, which they both worked on, as well as the sound novels that inspired Leaf Staff, which they didn't work on, the 1996 game is a mishmash of different aesthetics that's come to a life of its own online, separate from the game it's attached to. Sepia-tone photographs paint a dreary picture, contrasted by bright and cheery anime artwork that feels right out of a show like Slayers or Outlaw Star, making for a look that isn't just unique for its time, but period. The game looks distinct from Chunsoft's offerings in the Super Famicom due to using anime drawings rather than semi-transparent silhouettes, and even indie VNs now that use the sprites on pictures aesthetic have a distinctly different feel. There is something special to the way photos here are dithered, the way palettes shift to create the illusions of different times and moods, and the simplicity of the sprites, which comes together to craft something genuinely special. I get why people are as attached to this look as they are, even if it's better in isolation than practice. In Shizuku, this aesthetic worked perfectly because that game was dreary and unsettling on the whole, even during its more quiet moments. The clash of different styles added to the sense of surreality that Takahashi was aiming for, and my many complaints about the game be damned, really succeeded at. Kizuato, though, is a lighter and more anime-y game, which makes this feel very off at times. While the more tense and surreal moments benefit from this look, it ends up feeling frankly weird whenever the game tries to be anything else. Action scenes feel disjointed and disconnected, the slice of life feels more dour than it should, it just hangs a gloomy cloud over the whole game even when the writing isn't trying to do so, resulting in a clash of intent. The CGs only make this inconsistency worse because while they are the visual highlight of the game, brilliantly constructed, gorgeously detailed, and often immensely atmospheric, they also look completely out of line with the sewage filter backgrounds and blocky character sprites. It is jarring to say the least, and once again serves as an example of this game's aesthetic being better in isolation than execution. This is why I personally believe the 2009 version looks better on the whole. Illustrated by Mikihiro Amami, maybe best known outside of Japan for her work on Sky Wizards Academy, her artwork strikes a perfect balance between redesigning everything to be in line with the general look of anime from that era, while still maintaining a lot of the feel of the original. On the whole, I think this is a big improvement. All the inconsistencies in the style are smoothed out, and the game feels like it moves through different vibes far more smoothly. Action scenes are properly intense, slice of life scenes are properly comfy or silly, horror scenes are a lot scarier in general, and it all shifts around with ease. I also just really like Amami's style. Something about this kind of bright colored moe look that reached a peak in the late 2000s is really appealing to me, though whether or not that's just nostalgia talking, I have no idea. At the very least, I can say that Amami manages to avoid the common problem of making everyone look the exact same. The characters are all very distinct in age, mannerisms, and so forth. However, and this is a kinda important however, the PC-98's most common graphics mode features a much wider aspect ratio than was typical of Windows Edogate up until recently, and while the 2002 game mostly chose to crop CGs in order to fit this, Leaf decided for this release to rework and reimagine many of them. For some, this was as simple as taking the original shot and expanding the frame to fill space, which is fine, while for others, this resulted in radically different CGs that feel nothing like their pixel art counterparts. And honestly, while these are incredible pieces on their own, they don't capture the atmosphere the originals did. Part of me can't help but wonder if the PSP version of the game would have been more faithful with its wider resolution, and some of the decisions were made last minute when they had to go back to more contemporary PC Edogate resolutions, as some of the shots really feel like they were meant to be framed differently than they are. This change of atmosphere is further compounded by the look of all the CGs being homogenized. Almost everything that took place in the past in the 98 game looked like it was ripped out of a worn book, which made it feel that much more untouchable and distant, or even tragic in some cases. For whatever reason, that's just mostly gone here, and while it's certainly not a huge problem, it is a detail that changes the vibe of a few scenes in a way that's way less impactful than I think it should have been. All in all, I really don't think there's a perfect version of Kizuato in terms of art like there is for Shizuku and its renewal releases. Either you have a game that hits some incredible highs but is always constantly fighting itself, or you have a game that reaches a little less high and does some different directions in exchange for feeling more coherent. Personally, I think the latter is far more preferable, and my own love for the moe look at the time more than makes up for the lost bits of atmosphere. While we're on the topic of art, now is a great time to go in the Kizuato Kizuato's soundtrack. Like many of Leaf's titles, it was composed by a whole group of musicians. In this case, Shinya Ishikawa, Naoyoshi Makawa, and Kazuhide Nakagami, plus Takahashi himself contributed a single track for the game's more emotional scenes. Altogether, they composed an impressive 25 tracks, which was strong for a short VN back then and even now. Even more impressive is the fact that not one of these is a dud, and many would even go on to become all-time classics for the studio. Tameiki, or Asai, is probably perhaps the most famous, given that it appeared in the previously reviewed and massively popular White Album 2 during a segment that pays tribute to this game. It's a simple, solo piano piece that plays during many of the more contemplative moments, bringing with it a sense of longing and hollowness, beautifully evoked through its broken chords and simple melody, shifting through modes of cleverly placed accidentals. Being a solo piano piece makes it unique among the entire soundtrack, too, so it stands out even more when you hear it. In comparison, the rest tends to favor far fuller arrangements, with each of the heroine's themes having your typical set of pop instruments playing with and against each other. Chords on piano, synth accompaniments, slower energetic drum beats, catchy bass lines, and so forth, executed with a style and flair that still feels distinct and unique. Basically, shit be good and not fuck, but the level of good can vary wildly depending on what version you play and what hardware you're using. Like I mentioned before, the PC-98 game supported both MIDI and FM playback, but the former was designed specifically around use of a Roland sound canvas. Remember that MIDI isn't anything more than a data standard, so you could play it back on a bad Casio if you wanted to totally butcher it, but given something like what it was made for, or a professional keyboard like my Roland XP60 here, it's a remarkably great rendition of the score. In comparison, the FM music is fine, I guess. A lot of the instruments sound very basic, especially for a game that released the same year as Yuuya with its famously beautiful score, and long after both independent and studio composers had mastered the 98 sound hardware. To make it even more underwhelming, the game doesn't support the then commonplace stereo soundboard, meaning the FM music was limited to a mere 6 notes of polyphony and no sampling. It's a shame too, because I think with some better programming and use of that board, this could have easily beat the MIDI soundtrack, and that's already great. If you were playing this game on Windows back in '96, however, then you either had to use the MIDI score, which most people did not have the tens of thousands of yen worth of hardware to properly enjoy, or the CD music, which you definitely would have had the hardware given the game only released on CD for Windows. It is by far tied for my favorite version of this game's score, with some wonderfully 90s synthesizers used in its production. 2002 Renewal, in comparison, uses some recordings of the MIDI score seemingly from a later sound canvas model, which is fine, but not reorchestrating anything kind of feels like they were cheaping out for 2002. We were once again blessed with a proper new take on the soundtrack, however, in 2009, where Remake's soundtrack brought the quality up to snuff from what you could expect from VNs at the era. Everything was adjusted to work around studio quality synthesizers and samplers, and the sound selection here I think strikes a nice balance between the latest and greatest in music hardware and a vintage feel instilled by use of classic modules like the Roland JV1080. For what my 2 cents are apparently not worth to Aqua Plus, this is the best version of the soundtrack available. And this remake finally gives the game a proper animated opening with a theme in tow, titled Hanakotoba, sung by Suada. Fans of other Leaf works may recognize her as the singer for Utaware Rumono OPs, others may recognize her for Blue Drop and Card Fight Vanguard, and yet others may know her as the wife and frequent collaborator of Junpei Fujita, composer of the second OPs for Haruhi and Mirai Nikki, among many others. Suffice to say, Suada's singing is something that carries a pedigree with it, and Hanakotoba's incredible composition and lyrics, provided respectively by Kushiko and Shino, bring out the best in her voice for one beautiful work. It is without a doubt in my top 3 eroge songs, and that's quite a bit of praise given what I've covered on this channel. The ending theme, Utsusemi, is pretty good too, but it's not a total earworm like Hanakotoba is. Lastly, before we wrap up talking about the sound, I would be remiss not to mention the voice acting in the 09 game. While neither the original nor the 02 release had it, 2009 brought in a whole all-star cast to fill things out. To name a few, you have Kari Mizukashi, who played Tomoe Madoka, Ryoka Yuzuki, who played Satsuki in Kill la Kill, Nabatame Hitomi, who played Kazusa in White Album 2, and fucking Hiyama Nobuyuki, who played Hiei in Yu Yu Hakusho, and my boy Guy in Gao Gaigar, and shows up in a ton of mecha anime just all the time. It is a wild cast to say the least, and all of them brought their A game to Kizuato. Every seiyuu plays their role perfectly, hams it up when it's appropriate, and generally seems to have had a blast working on this game judging by how strong their performances are. It really brings the game together in a way you don't otherwise get. And speaking of bringing things together, I think it's now a good time to start diving into the spoiler territory. While I don't have a ton to say about the plot of the game, I think it still has a couple interesting threads of ideas present. On the way our past can haunt us, how our families can fail us, and how we can become ourselves, are all explored in the game to an extent. But first, a quick break for the Patreon segment to thank all the donors and sponsors who make this possible, and shout out some cool people that you should check out. Hello everyone and welcome to the Patreon segment, that time of the video to give life and channel updates, shout out cool people you should check out, thank the donors and sponsors who make this possible, and yeah, stuff. For the first of those, as apparent by this video going up, I am back from my vacation in the US and now cozied up again in my apartment in Brazil. To those who haven't followed the last few Patreon segments, I took a 10-day vacation in the Midwest in order to see friends, grab some stuff, and do other things. It was interesting to visit the US as a tourist rather than a resident, since it made it a lot easier to focus on the positives rather than the day-to-day negatives of living there. The Cleveland was as fun as ever to tour around and shop around with its galleries of stuff and neat little markets, and helping my good friend Andy run a stall of retro computers and various collection items for display and sale at CGC was just as fun as it was last year. Frankly, even more so given that we had a couple extra friends and my dear husband helping out. Special shoutouts to the couple of people who knew my channel and to all the cool folks in general that stopped by to play on the computers, clear out our collective collections of collected curiosities, or just chat about game development and life. Hopefully I'll be able to see y'all next year and bring back plenty more trinkets of all shapes and sizes. As for channel updates, the main thing is that I'm actually starting to assemble a proper set at the new apartment, as you've probably seen earlier in this video. It looks and feels better to operate than anything I had prior to this, and especially the impromptu setups I had to do while staying at B&Bs, though I would still like to expand on it with additional shelving and more items on display. But hey, that's a problem for future Amelie Doree to deal with. And without any good way to transition into this, I again want to thank everyone who donates to this channel and makes this possible. Being at $2,000 a month stably, minus the massive chunk that taxes take out, has allowed me to focus a lot more on creating good videos and less on stressing about money and life than I was even just a handful of months ago. And it always warms my heart to see new people joining in after hearing about my videos from another viewer, the algorithm, whatever, and having a blast going through the backlog. So, as I always say, y'all are amazing and thank you so much for making this channel possible and as good as it is. And as always, I want to try and give back to the community by shouting out people who make cool stuff, whether they've suggested themselves to me, been suggested by others, or have just stumbled upon them on my own. And if you would like a chance at being highlighted here, feel free to drop me a line via Blue Sky, Tumblr, email, or Patreon DMs. I am always looking for more folks to shout out, especially right now as I'm starting to run a little low on people, given that Twitter getting banned where I live has made communicating with fans a lot harder than before, and subsequently, it hasn't been as easy to find people to give attention to here. Except, hi, editing Noel coming in. Twitter got unbanned here, so I guess now you can contact me on Twitter again. But regardless, there are still lots of cool people, and the first I'd like to shout out here is Efi, a good friend of mine who's been getting around in games writing lately, including contributing to a few websites as well as the second adult analysis anthology, which takes a look at adult games and the culture surrounding them. That in and of itself is a whole neat thing that I'll link to in the accompanying Patreon post for this video, which is free to view by the way, but it's not what I want to focus on here. Instead, I want to mention his website on NeoCities, which collects a lot of his writings, as well as more casual ramblings and thoughts on games. There is a lot of really neat and easy reading on there, with his article on Fate Samurai Remnant especially standing out to me. It's a game I didn't really know much about before, besides thinking the character Saber was super cute, but his brief and informative exploration of the game's ideas in relation to the rest of the franchise and the peculiarities of its Musou gameplay has me actually interested in trying it for myself. All of his writing is really solid like that, so if you want some nice light reading on games familiar and new, then go and check his stuff out. The second thing I want to shout out this month is actually a bit self-indulgent since it's a game I worked on, but I'm proud of my work on it and especially that of the other developers. It is Witching Stone, a puzzle deck builder developed by Alexander Taylor with additional art done by Sam Miller and a soundtrack by yours truly, which pulls inspiration from classic Capcom arcade games and PC-98 titles. Alex was an awesome person to work with some really cool ideas for his games, something that a few viewers may already know, as his titles Sokobot and Toho Library Survivors were something that friends of mine spoke highly of when I mentioned working on this title. Witching Stone falls much in line with that coolness, so if you'd like to check it out, then consider giving it a go. It's got a free demo and it's only $15. Plus, you can buy the soundtrack separately for $5 if you'd like to support me directly and get the tunes in high quality for casual listening. It's cool stuff. Links to the links are in the description. Alrighty then, since there weren't enough Patreon questions to warrant a Patreon Q&A section for this specific video, I just have one last thing before we wrap up this segment, and that is a very quick word from the sponsor of this video and returning friend of the channel, Very OK Vinyl. If you haven't heard of them before, they're a vinyl distribution company based out of Ontario, Canada, selling high quality records of soundtracks from anime, VNs, other games, and all sorts of neat stuff. It's been a while since I've last talked about them, and in that time, they've had some pretty awesome releases. There's things like Demon Doll, a collaborative album of songs using the English Kaito Vocaloid sound bank, and the highlight of this video, Nie no Hakoniwa, a fascinating and intense visual novel with an equally fascinating and intense soundtrack provided by composer Manyo and printed on beautiful crimson discs. Everything about VOV's prints takes great advantage of the format, from their wonderful and warm mastering to their fantastic packaging, often including plenty of extra feelies and gorgeous artwork that looks amazing on a shelf, in a frame, or hanging out next to your record player while you take an evening to yourself and some quality tunes. So if you'd like like to check any of those records out, or anything else exciting they have coming down the line, which there is plenty, then head on over to veryokvinyl.com today and get yourself some records while supplies last. And while you're over there, why not sign up for their newsletter to keep up with cool releases and check out the other records they have on offer from other companies. There's plenty of awesome stuff there, like Persona soundtracks, city pop bangers, and vintage anime and games favorites, so there is bound to be something for you or a music lover in your life. Again, huge thanks to VOV for sponsoring this video and continuing to be awesome, not just with their support of this channel, but for all of their work in keeping game music alive in new and exciting forms. And with that, we have reached the end of the Patreon segment. Once again, a massive thank you goes to everyone who donates and makes it possible for me to do this as my full-time job. And if you would like to help keep this show running and growing ever better, then consider donating monthly via Patreon or Ko-fi, or one-time via the latter. In exchange, you'll get to sometimes see videos early, see what cowardly advertisers don't want you to, vote on and suggest games to cover, get your name on the side of the screen for all the other lovely people, ask questions for this segment, see monthly updates, and other neat things, all for a minimum of $1 per month. There is no pressure to donate more, as no content is locked by tier, and there's no pressure to donate at all, really. As I always say, simply watching these videos, liking, commenting, subscribing, and especially sharing them around to friends and groups are a massive part of what makes this possible, and I'm thankful for every little bit of support that's given, whether financial or not. So again, a massive thank you to every single one of you, and let's get back to the show. Kizuato is a bit of a difficult game to write an analysis about, and not for the usual reasons. As I've mentioned throughout this video, the game is far from the level of complexity and deepness that's even in pornographic VNs now. Nowadays, titles that market themselves on horrific extreme splendor, like Shinjuku or Dasaku, are home to poignant themes about society and humanity. Back then, however, even a totally plot-focused title like Kizuato didn't need to be thought-provoking, just entertaining. Even Takahashi himself said that his goal was to make an interesting game, which certainly a game that starts with a small town murder and ends with an asexually reproducing whale god carrying angry telepathic humans across space in his highly decorated Star Trek-esque tummy as a spaceship is interesting. Still, the lack of depth very much bites the game all throughout with how it teases interesting ideas and doesn't follow through on them all the way. But it does still have thematic ideas, and of what is here, I think what fascinated me the most is the brief exploration of generational trauma, with glimpses at this idea coming from the very start. As mentioned prior, Koichi's arrival to his cousin's home isn't on the best terms. His estranged father has just passed away mysteriously, his cousins seem to be hiding things from him, parts of his forgotten past seem like they're being kept, and he keeps having dreams about an inner self encouraging him to give in to desires and powers. All of this reaches a head when, while hanging out with Asusa's friend, the urge to kill grows strong inside him and he sprints out of the room in a panic, faints outside somewhere, and sees a vision of multiple people being murdered. Once the news confirms that this really did happen, Koichi goes onto the scene to learn more and ends up meeting with a local journalist, Kyoko, who tells him that perhaps the legendary Uzukiyama Oni are responsible for the killing. Rumored to be creatures of horrible bloodshed, Koichi cannot shake the possibility that perhaps one of them is lurking inside him. And so, after preparing an alibi to test whether or not he really is the creature, he goes to sleep at home and has yet another vision. Once again, the monster lurks the town and it sets its sights on another woman that Koichi knows, Kyoko, before suddenly, Chizuru steps in with only powers in tow. Jumping incredible heights and doing battle with bone-shattering claws, the killer escapes without his prey as Chizuru takes Kyoko to safety and vows that she must kill Koichi. Though he knows now from having never left his cozy futon that he can't be the killer, he's instead filled with a new terror over what Chizuru said, and that terror only grows further when she comes back home and says that she has something important to talk about, the history of the family. Essentially, Koichi's uncle and father died not by murder, but by suicide, as if in the bloodline of the Kashiwagi flows the blood of the Uzukiyama Oni, blood which gives powers of incredible strength at an incredible cost. While the women of the family can learn to control their powers and they retain their human appearance even when transformed, the men turn into terrifying beasts with nigh unstoppable impulses to kill and ravage, urged on by a voice inside. Koichi's father and uncle, with aunt in tow, realized that they could fight their instincts no longer and took their own lives to save everyone else, leaving Chizuru at times alone to raise her sisters as if she were their mother. This power is also why Koichi's father disappeared 8 years ago. The mysterious scar on Koichi's body had to do with an accident in childhood, where, after diving into a lake to retrieve a shoe Asusa had lost in it, he got trapped by debris and nearly died. The threat of losing his life caused his powers to awaken, and with an urge to murder the first people he could, only stopped by his weakened state leading him to pass out and forget what happened. Koichi's father, fearing his own struggles may reawaken his son's powers, left in an agreement with his wife that it would be best for their child if he was gone. son. And so, at the tender age of 12, Koichi was without a father. In exchange, his cousins now once again had someone to care for them following the passing of their own parents. All these years, Koichi has felt resentment towards his dad and jealousy towards his cousins for having his father around, when it turns out his father has only been looking out for him and kept a distance because he assumed, without trying to reach out, that all Koichi wanted was for him to stay away. All he could do was watch his hurting son from afar, waiting for the day he would say something. His cousins did their best to follow suit and be quiet too, in hopes that perhaps Koichi could live a life without powers ever awakening again. Maybe things could be good again. But now that he knows and is falsely suspected by Chizuru to be the murderer, she sees the only humane choice to be killing him despite how much it hurts her, lest more people die for the sake of his cursed life. Despite his protests and begging for Chizuru to have faith in him, she ultimately manages to chase him into the river where he begins to drown, only for the real menace to appear. A mysterious Oni far stronger than her and filled with bloodlust and desire. And yet, just like in the past, being near death leads Koichi's powers to spring to life as he miraculously masters them to do battle with the terrible monster and save Chizuru. Finally, the tragedy of the Kashiwagi bloodline is over. Of all the routes in the game, Chizuru's is probably the most complete as a story. From start to end, it does a fantastic job at gripping the player without having too many of the game's writing flaws creep in, and it helps that it stars by far the most fleshed out heroine. Chizuru is by no means deep, but there is something to her backstory at the minimum that makes her kinda memorable. Like would become common for Onesama archetypes and VNs, she's held an immense amount of responsibility all throughout her life that she should have never had to. She had to raise her siblings until her uncle arrived following the double suicide of her father and mother. She held on to the deep and dark secrets of the family and protected them, and she even succeeded the family company after Koichi's father passed away, leading her to be the subject of constant rumors and gossip. It makes everything involving Koichi harder for her as she felt she had to keep her distance, hoping that perhaps if she and the other cousins stayed quiet, that he could live a normal life. Perhaps the two could even become close to each other if all went well, as Koichi's presence reminds her greatly of the uncle that helped care for her and her sisters when she was all alone in the world. Instead, she was faced with the prospect that she may very well have to end his life by her own hands, something which she does in one of the best bad endings, a painful and tragic scene knowing that not only did she have the wrong culprit, not only did she have the wrong idea that Koichi was helpless to his powers, but that it also meant leaving herself all alone for a misguided greater good. But given the circumstances, can she really be blamed for not trusting Koichi's insistence at first? His past, and particularly his dreams, show how terrifying the bloodline is, and there was clearly some sort of Oni running around and murdering people. Whoever that killer is, and whatever they are, has clearly succumbed to the seductive force of power that Koichi's uncle and father wanted to save others from, even if it meant leaving a scar on those around them. It's good drama that adds good personal stakes to an already compelling mystery, and how this route resolves, with Koichi being the one to break the incel rage combo streak of his family, still leaves the game with some curious mysteries right after solving one. In particular, who is that other monster if only 5 Kashiwagi are still alive and they're all accounted for? During a part of the common route, which is the part I synopsized at the beginning of the video, Chizuru is stopped right before she goes off to work in order to be grilled by 2 cops on her uncle's death, Genzaburo Nagase and Yuuya Yanagawa. Though Genzaburo is just a typical old detective man and possibly a relative of Shizuku's Genichiro Nagase, Yuuya is a lot more in this story than just a kid out of the academy, as we soon learn in Azusa's route. He is also the most interesting part of this route, since Azusa herself is about as thought-provoking as wet cardboard. She has no internal conflict, no interesting motivations, barely any personality besides anger. She literally just wants to save her classmate and kill the guy who's responsible. She also loves Koichi, I guess, but their romance is extremely tacked on and doesn't come up until the last 15 minutes, so What we do learn from one of Koichi's dreams in this route, however, which breaks off after the night of the first killing, is that the man responsible for the murders lives at a place owned by someone of the name Takayuki, a local convenience store worker that Azusa and Koichi take it upon themselves to track down so they can save Kari, and soon after locating his place, call on the police to investigate the apartment with. None other than our detective lad Yuuya himself shows up, who agrees to enter the apartment of both of them to apprehend our killer, and they find their friends bound up and drugged, along with an empty man, Takayuki, in the corner. It's not long, however, before the duo finds themselves in this same fate, as it turns out that Yuuya has been the killer this entire time, an illegitimate child of the Kashiwagi family, bearing the same only blood as Koichi, and linked to him telepathically. As revealed in a side route between Kaede and Hatsune's roots, his birth was the result of Chizuru's father, Koichi's uncle, cheating with another woman, who opted to keep the child instead of getting an abortion. All by herself, she cared for Yuuya, while her uncle refused to acknowledge the existence of him, leading to a rather lonely life after moving out. However, one day, he happened across a young man living at the apartment next to his, Takayuki, a bright kid who loved to play guitar and hang out. He brought life into Yuuya's life, and the other way around, something they both needed as Takayuki was troubled too, being a young gay youth in an abusive relationship with an older drug-dealing Yakuza man. In order to cope with the pain, Takayuki used the same mysterious drugs that the man sold. And one day, over exactly that, a particularly brutal fight broke out between the two, as Takayuki was broken, beaten, battered, and assaulted right in front of Yuuya's eyes. And it was that time that Yuuya's powers awoke, under the call of one simple feeling: that man must die for what he's done to Takayuki. Left hollow from the abuse and the substances, Takayuki would never be the same again, and with his horrifying powers awoken and the voice growing stronger, Yuuya slowly fell to an addiction of his very own. The high of the power of giving into his most base instincts gave, the high that led him to kill all of those people, kidnap Kari, and now torture Azusa and Koichi, all under the pretense that what he's doing will free these people from their human coils and enter a realm of pleasure. But of course, Koichi believes this is merely the Oni in him speaking. Yuuya is simply using his incel rage power to justify his horrible actions and trauma. Rage which Koichi learns in that very moment to contain and channel. Rage which Azusa believes it is unfair for him to indulge while her family died to protect others from it. Rage which Takayuki believes must be ended as he pulls a gun on Yuuya and ends the farce. While the Azusa part of the Azusa route kind of fucking blows, honestly. I didn't say much about it because there is nothing to say about it. The Yuuya part of it, along with his later side story, make for some of the most gripping content the game has to offer and serves as a counter to a theme which Chizuru's route brings up. In there's an idea that sometimes family cares more about you than you ever realize. Merely by being tied through blood, these people think about you and they want the best for you even if you don't know or accept it. It's seen in how Chizuru reveals that Koichi's father really did truly care for him all this time, and even the cousins who were keeping their distance were doing so in order to give him the chance at a happy life. And while I am a little bit suspect of how close the game verges on saying unconditionally love your family, I do think it's easy enough to read the depth needed to skirt around that and find something comforting. As someone who's rebuilding their relationship with their family while keeping in mind all the ways I was hurt and I them, it did make me feel a little fuzzy inside to see. However, not everyone gets that privilege of having ever felt loved, and Yuuya's backstory actually reflects that. Yuuya didn't really have a family because of his father's shitty actions, and it's safe to say that his mother may not have been in the best place either, given she pops out of his story following him entering adult society. While Koichi at least gets the pleasure of knowing his father cared for him at the end of each main route, Yuuya gets nothing. The only true friend he's really had gets torn away from him by horrible circumstances, and all he's left with is a cursed bloodline that, without any support, he doesn't have a chance to fight against. I also think the parallel between Yuuya and Koichi is interesting, as the two are very similar people thrown into very different circumstances. In a way, Yuuya is kind of like an evil Koichi who abandoned his ideals of peace and justice after experiencing a life of horrible pain, hardship, and loss, whereas Koichi continues down his path even knowing his history may lead him to the same fate. I wonder what two characters that kind of sounds like. While the game doesn't engage in any deeper dialogue than this with the concept, it is still a poignant and simple metaphor for the difficulty of fighting your own trauma and past. However, I really must again bring into question the views of this game. Like, I am being charitable of how it talks about family and assuming the message isn't you should just forgive your parents no matter what, with regard to Chizuru's route, as the route by itself and even later scenes really support that view. I seriously wish this game honed in on more of the family drama and explored it better, because there is a good subversion and exploration of that idea here waiting to be unraveled beyond a few lines of text in a side route. Second, I am very baffled by the only two gay characters in this game being someone trapped in a horrible relationship and a walking sexual harassment punchline, while there is plenty of portrayed as healthy straight relationships available to the protagonists, with their cousins no less. Look, I am all for portraying messy queer people. I have made multiple videos on incredible works about that, but that contrast combined with the queer characters seemingly only existing as punchlines and shock value and not really doing anything with them as people really makes me question what Takahashi was cooking here. Did he know what ingredients he was adding? Does he know what a saucepan is? Who knows? All I know is that what comes from here is at least funnier in its ridiculousness. Kaede and Hatsune's route collectively make up the second half of Kizuato's story, and as heroine routes, they are more barren than a Donna-killed depression. Kaede's route only has a vague semblance of backstory from the 2002 release onward, wherein Koichi tells her she was wrong to attack kids who were trying to assault her in middle school, so that's awesome. And Hatsune gets fucking nothing. They are just I love you since long ago romances, and okay, this isn't actually any funnier than what I was talking about a moment ago. I'm sorry. I promise we'll get to the asexual telepathic whale god soon. Did you forget about him? I didn't. What these roots are really about is the full history of the Uzukiyama Oni blood in the Kashiwagi family, that of a clan whose true name is the Elku, creatures with incredible strength and telepathic powers. According to the most complete version of the local myth, the blood became part of some humans when hundreds of years ago, a samurai named Emonjiro was ordered by his feudal lord to do battle with vicious Oni to protect his land, and was nearly murdered alongside his entire battalion. Left as the only human survivor, there was but one Oni, their princess Edelfell, who took pity on the man and used her own blood to heal him, turning him into one of them in an act of love and kindness. Though Aemon was at first in denial and pain of losing his humanity, he soon fell in love with Edelfell, only to lose her not long after. The other Oni, including her two eldest sisters, saw this woman as a betrayer and ordered her dead, and since Aemon's former comrades no longer accepted him as an ally, he was left without a home and without his love. The only solaces he found were in slaughtering those who killed his beloved as an act of revenge, and in her sister, who believed in the same dream of peace and ultimately bore his children. As we already know, this is not mere myth, as the bloodline continues into the modern day of the story, but it goes far deeper than that. In truth, they are all reincarnated souls of those from the history. Emonjiro became Kashiwagi Koichi, and the four sisters became his four cousins. Azael, the oldest and a fierce commander, became Chizuru. Rizael, the second born and a brave warrior, became Azusa. Edelfell, the third born and esteemed princess, became Kaede, and Lynette, their priestess, became Hatsune. Though they are now all different people, they all bear the weight of their bloodline and the horrors of the past. Seen in full in Hatsune's route when one fateful night, as her and Koichi are out playing with fireworks, a mysterious charm that her father gave her begins glowing in the night. Its light leads them to a dark, mysterious, winding cave, where inside spirits begin calling out to their past names, vengeful over their deaths in the war, and particularly to Lynette. And this is where things start to go off the rails. What I'm about to say is mostly from the first post-credits Omake segment and not Hatsune's route, but it is canonically what happens, and frankly her route already goes crazy, so there's no reason not to go all the way now. Essentially, the lore of Kizuato is that since time immemorial, there's been a species of whale gods who became known as the mountain gods by humans and the Yolk by the Elku. They're telepathic asexual hermaphroditic, which is the word used here because it's the 90s, beings that live in communities, but one day, one decided to venture off on his own like a fucking idiot, and he lost contact with all of his whale god friends and spent the next some years roaming the galaxy. By chance, he happened upon a planet populated by humans of two categories, those without telepathic powers and those with. The telepathic humans get horribly tortured for being abnormal, and when the whale god found out about this, he saved them and granted their wish for superpowers so they could go slaughter humans in revenge while traveling across the stars inside his hollow insides. This turned out to be a horrible mistake, as the desire for revenge didn't go away once they reached safety. It evolved over time into an innate hunting instinct and need for violence, turning them into creatures of destruction. Not wanting to undo his actions, however, the whale god simply put up with it and kept quiet about his nature so the telepathic humans could continue to go about in their suspiciously whale-shaped spaceship, murdering random humans. This all reached a turning point, however, when Lynette was born. Unlike her two eldest sisters and her undecided third sister, she thought murder was bad, and the whale god liked this so much that he gave her his Discord handle. One day, however, he told her that he has to give birth, and if they continue their voyage, then his babies will die and he'll become infertile. So she made the decision to stop on the nearest star, which just so happened to be Earth. This, of course, would lead the Elku to die horribly in the battles, but not knowing any of this, the rest of them blamed her for everything that was to follow, thought she just sucked at piloting ships, and their damned spirits desire revenge against her and Aemon to this day. Though those spirits nearly kill Hatsune and Koichi in the cave, his dad loaded up the Jo stone with his shining essence just for a situation like this, killing all except one last spirit. Deep inside the cave is the whale god himself and their spaceship, the Yolk. All this time, an Elku named Daliel has been waiting patiently for a chance to talk with Aemon again, as the spirit of him channels itself for Koichi to say goodbye to the fellow warrior. One sequel hook and a couple magic words to take them back to safety spouted later, and the Yolk reactivates, voyaging once again and ending Kizuato. I have said throughout this video that Kizuato's ending is fucking bizarre, and hopefully you understand why now. It is fascinating to me just how quickly the game 180s from believable and grounded mythology to actually it was aliens, and then goes for the fucking slam dunk in the Omake segment where the whale god himself reveals all of his deep lore to a kid Koichi right before the incident happens. It very much feels like it was thrown in for the sake of surprising readers, which was definitely a style at the time. The writer of Sayonara Oshiete as well as Ayayo-san, the former of which being one of the big three Denpa titles, and both of which which are games I've covered before, lamented in an interview the loss of exactly this with an eroge. Scenario writers came up with crazy shit in the honor of things like eroguro nonsense, and that died out in favor of more straightforward stories such as 1999's Canon, which he believes is a part of why Sayo-oshi, a game released in the very early 2000s, failed so horribly at market. Kizoato definitely does not reach that level of absurdity, nor is the game ever quite as brutal as something like Sayo-oshi or even its immediate predecessor Shizuku, but the ending does present that kind of insanity and wackiness that makes this game feel like it would become a kusoge Twitter joke in 5 seconds. And ultimately, I don't think that's bad. Honestly, it's pretty fun and memorable, but I also have to wonder just what Takahashi was going for with this story besides being interesting and weird. Like, on one hand, there's clearly the idea of generational trauma and identity running throughout, as I've mentioned prior, and even with this ending. One of Koishi's last sentences, as he and Hatsune ponder what being reincarnated means for them, is that only Emonjiro knows what Emonjiro felt, because he's him and I'm me. A sentiment of self-actualization that's in line with the general idea that you are you. It's seen most prominently in Koichi breaking free from his past, becoming his own person with control over powers that no one else in his family could control. However, what Takahashi himself says the story is about is the necessity of healing, that perhaps we should just all go back to the rural countryside sometimes and escape from society, reconnect with our family and friends, and discover the beauty of the world, which I guess I can kind of see that. The game is all about Koichi returning to his family, discovering his family cares about him, and the bad parts of his family don't have to define him or his family. That's kind of where that idea ends, isn't it? It is a central idea, a plot-defining idea, and the game really doesn't engage in any deeper dialogue about healing and generational trauma beyond what I've said. It's merely setup. It gestures at concepts to say, isn't this interesting? But it doesn't know what to do with them. There was room here to talk about the discrimination of the Elku and death, their potentially complex relationship to colonialism with going from hunted to hunter to hunted, more about the Kashiwagi bloodline in their past. Ultimately, all of that is pushed to the wayside and never ruminated on. And I guess I'm kind of conflicted about that. On one hand, I wish it set its sights higher, not just as someone whose career it is to discuss works in order to communicate ideas of a broader audience, but as a fan of media that has ambition with its ideas and at least tries to do something more than show basic, inoffensive concepts that were pastiche even at the time without more exploration or insight. But on the other hand, I guess I'm kind of glad I didn't have to think super hard for once. I constantly write on this channel about serious topics like deep traumatic events, modern politics, the sex dystopia of the US, war and colonialism, and a lot of other stuff that is just so brain rotting to discuss. In a way, it's kind of nice to have something that's just simple, with works to talk about and fun bits to highlight. I think I can live with that. Oh god, I didn't talk about Rika yet, did I? Console ports of visual novels have long been known for two things. One is the removal of adult content to appease rating boards held by old conservative folks who may or may not be in leagues of foundations championing for batshit copyright policies, and two is the addition of new content written by people who typically don't have nearly enough experience or time for the responsibilities that they've been given in a hurry. Sometimes the stars align and you get what is arguably a definitive version of a game, and other times, Rika happens. Taking place 2 weeks after the events of Kizoato's ending, it was written entirely by Jiggy, and assistants who worked on Two Heart 2's Sidequel, the second Tears of Tiara, and on the PS3 remake Staster port of White Album. I haven't read any of those, so I can't speak to the quality of them, but unfortunately, Rika's route is just not good. The crux of it is that one day, while Koichi is out, he stumbles upon a little maid at the train station who begs to come along with him, and it turns out that she has an evil sister who's been kidnapping people. From there, him and the other siblings go on a quest to uncover the maid's past as Oni Ninja, defeat the evil one, and save the day. It would be fun if it were a fun and well-executed sequel with the same gusto as the original game, or an ambitious attempt at expanding on the themes the original game only teased, bringing the whole package together into something incredible. But the plot is basically a 5-hour-long Saturday morning cartoon. All 4 of the sisters are flanderized to hell and back. Rika is just a squishy, embarrassable blob, and Koichi in particular is absurdly stupid. He legitimately cannot tell Rika and her sister, voiced by Kazusa White Album 2, apart, despite the fact they dress different and talk very, very different. So most of the plot is spent with him going, "Oh my god, I couldn't tell them apart and I'm in danger!" Look man, I don't like to dunk on stuff on this channel. I feel bad that I'm being a snarky little bitch right now, but I was fucking frustrated at points reading this, especially once I reached the ending and realized it just doesn't do anything. The 2 ways the plot resolves are either nothing changes for anybody, or Koichi gets 2 live-in maids at his solo apartment. There is no great mystery, no fun hijinks, no interesting ideas, just 6 hours of mediocre rom-com-esque writing, bad action scenes, empty conclusion, and a single good hot spring CG. Having 2 cute live-in maids is a pretty cute ending as well, but I cannot feel victorious about this whatsoever. If there's anything I can say for this route, it's that it made me appreciate what the base game of Kizoato got right. It's not amazing, it's not perfect, but it's fun despite its flaws, and it knows what it is. It's mostly well written, it goes off the rails in entertaining ways, and it manages to hold itself together through sheer inertia alone. And I think that, in all of its alien space whale god glory, is enough. At the end of it all, do I recommend Kizuato? And the answer to that is a maybe, leaning on a yes, kinda, I don't know. As I said all the way back in the intro, it's a game that really exemplifies the in-between period of the late 90s for edoge. Because on one hand, the game struggles with plenty of flaws that were common at the time, burgeoning on antiquated, particularly its characters and themes being weaker than one would expect even from works a mere 2 years younger than it. But on the other hand, there was a clear effort to develop something new, fresh and captivating that, because of when it came out, feels familiar yet different to what we know now. It's a silly and over-the-top ride that takes itself seriously enough to be believable, but not enough for its flaws to become game-breaking when they do turn up. And they certainly do. I think Kizuato is a fine and enjoyable title, but, and especially in comparison to later Leaf games such as the seminal White Album 2, previously covered, and the fantastic 99, which I plan to cover, I can't think of much value to it except for those interested in the VN equivalent of a B-movie OVA, or those with interest in its historical value. Which, as much as I am fine with both of those things, I do think it's kind of a shame because you can see inklings of interesting ideas here with how it explores generational trauma, family ties, and self-actualization, but Takahashi never truly grasps onto those things. It is also sad to me that no remake of this game ever did so. The 2002 story changes were welcome, but minor in the long run. The 2009 appended route felt like every bad moege trope of the era meshed into one flanderized mess of a journey. Had more time been put into the base story and better writers assigned to it, I really think Kizuato could have been turned into something amazing that holds its own against what it inspired. But maybe we also didn't really need that. Writers like Kinoko Nasu, Gen Urobuchi, and Ryukishio 7 hopped right on realizing the potential in this format and this genre of adventure gaming that Leaf demonstrated with Kizuato. They took the Chunibyo superpowers, the small town legends, the dark family histories, the character archetypes, and all that captivated people on a fundamental level here, and made some truly fantastic stories out of it that did incredible things with shadowed text layered on sprites and backgrounds. What Kizuato I think really represents is the proper beginning of an incredible legacy that's still ongoing, and has been responsible for so many works that inspire me to create for myself. The genesis of the thrilling horror and enticing action that captivated me in my teens. The genesis of the multi-route structure that gave us masterpieces like Subarashiki Hibi, and the work that inspired authors that propelled an industry responsible for the wonderful career I have now. And that, even for all of its flaws and how half-baked it is in some ways, is something I can never be grateful enough for.